Our lecture tonight will be given by Dr. Stephen Kuehl. He got his BA in geology from Lafayette College and his MS and PhD in geological oceanography from North Carolina State University. His 44-year research career has focused on river deltas and associated shelf mud deposits from around the world, many of which will be referred to during tonight's presentation. Dr. Kuehl is credited with the discovery of subaqueous or underwater deltas, and his recent work has focused on the role of these vast mud deposits in modulating climate change through sequestration of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So help me welcome Dr. Kuehl to the stage.
Thank you, Candace. And it's great to see all our friends and neighbors here tonight. And it's really a pleasure for me to be able to share this presentation. And I have to say, I had a lot of fun putting this presentation together for you tonight. Glorious Mud. Another, I guess, an alternate title might be Following Mud's Journey from Land to Ocean, because that's been kind of the topic of my research for the last 40 or so years. And the picture on the right is actually a photo from one of our trips down the Yangtze River, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later on. So just to kind of give you a sense of where we're going, this is the outline for tonight's talk. I'm going to talk about some of the uses and some of the abuses of mud by humans. I want to give you a scientific definition of mud. I think you all have a general sense for what it is, but I'll let you know how scientists define it. We'll talk about its history, how it formed, when it formed, and its role in the global carbon cycle, which is really kind of a focus for tonight's talk. And then we're going to take a trip down the Yangtze. We'll go from the mountains down to the ocean to show you what it looks like as it transits the Earth out to the ocean. And then we'll talk about one of the major depot centers, or one of the major sinks for mud on Earth, which is the river deltas near shore, and then their offshore mud deposits. And then talk a little bit about these mud deposits as a global carbon sink. And I want to show you some of my recent research as an example in the Irrawaddy Delta. So you might be interested to know where the title for tonight's talk came. It's actually a song by Flanders and Swan back in 1958. And so this is the refrain from that talk: mud, mud, glorious mud, nothing quite like it for cooling the blood. So follow me, follow, down to the hollow, and there let me wallow in glorious mud. So some of the uses and misuses of mud. Mud has, in terms of human history, it's had many practical and applied uses in terms of for pottery, for making pots, and for many millennia used for making bricks, right? If you, where would colonial Williamsburg and state government buildings be without bricks? It's used in cosmetics. It's also used, interestingly, for drilling. As we search for natural resources in the earth, drilling mud is very important, because you pump it down the borehole and all the bits and shards come floating back out. And then here we just kind of give you a little sense of some of the more advanced uses in the medical fields for muds. It's used as a drug delivery system, transdermal delivery. Of course, some of it is we can take for digestional issues, and also for osteoarthritis. So there are lots of different uses for mud. There are some misuses of mud, or maybe another way is to say people enjoy mud, right? I mean, as a kid, didn't you just like to go out and splash in a puddle? So this was really interesting to me. So I was aware of a few different festivals, mud festivals in the world, but it turns out that the Boryong Mud Festival is the biggest. Millions of people come to this every year, and they just have a lot of fun. So in 2017, the Kiwis from New Zealand figured they would take an example from South Korea. And so they actually imported mud from South Korea to Rotorua, New Zealand, and they held the Mudtopia Festival in 2017. And there was a huge uproar because the local government was upset that they used state funds to fly mud from South Korea down to New Zealand. Of course, the Germans have been into it forever. Back in the north of the country, they have a very muddy coastline, and so they have what's called the Mud Olympics, which has been going on for many, many years. And even right here at home, of course, it's not the Olympics or a festival, but it's the Mud Wars. So this is the Extreme Mud War Festival in Tampa, Florida. Getting back on a more serious note, muds are also often associated with human contaminants, right? So here are some local examples. This is from the Elizabeth River, where shipbuilding and creosote dumping into the river has resulted in the creation of a Superfund site, which we're still dealing with today. But you can see the sheen of the creosote on the surface of the water just oozing out of the sediments. And many of these contaminants that are associated with sediments are hydrophobic. So they tend to dislike the water and they glom onto the sediment particles. And so where the mud goes, the contaminants go. Same is true for another historical contaminant in Virginia. This is a even more serious one, a release of ketone from Allied Chemical, culminating back in 1975, where a number of folks got very sick. It's a neurotoxin, and it's still today buried and alive in the James River. But it's buried under the sediment, so it's not as bioavailable as it once was, but it's still there. So be careful if you dig in the James River. Mud is also considered to be a pollutant based on EPA regulations, along with nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's particularly evident like during a major storm, like after Tropical Storm Lee in 2011. And so here we're sitting right here at Gloucester Point. This is the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay right here, and you can see this incredibly high turbidity water, or mud, aka mud, being dumped into the Chesapeake Bay. And a lot of this happens currently because of human effects on the landscape, right? Through agriculture, construction, and so forth, we've liberated a lot of soils. And so when it rains, it's particularly impactful on these waterways and can create issues with siltation and also affect primary production in these important areas. So let me give you a definition of mud. So I'll give you two. One is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So if you Google this, you'll see that mud is a slimy, sticky mixture of solid material with a liquid and especially water, right? So I think that's pretty intuitive. When you think about mud, you think about this slimy, sticky mixture. But that's actually not how scientists think about mud. We define it a little bit differently. So when I think about mud, I think about the fine-grained component of soil. And when I say fine-grained, I mean particles that are less than 63 microns, which is the boundary between sand, like you would see on Virginia Beach, and finer material like silt, which you would see in the estuaries. So it's less than 63 microns in diameter. It's a mixture of both silt and clay, typically. And importantly, particularly for this talk, is that it contains a mixture of inorganic minerals along with organic matter, such as organic carbon, that is some of which is physically bound to the mineral matter. It can also contain particulate organic carbon, which is carbon that exists freely, like leaf fragments or shards of wood, something like that. But there's two components to the organic carbon in mud. One is bound to the minerals, and one is kind of free to move about. So so when I think about mud, that's how I define it. And if we look at the history of mud, and we have to kind of go back in time. So this is where my geology roots kind of come out a little bit. And so this is just kind of the spiral would be the history of Earth. And before starting the spiral, there was, of course, what we think the creation 12 billion years ago of the universe. Sometime after that, suns formed and then became supernovas, which is the only way we can have elements of higher atomic number than hydrogen and helium, right? So when people say we're made of stardust, we actually are made of stardust. Our best guess about the age of the Earth is based on rocks that we've collected is about 4.6 billion years. And you have to go a long time from the formation of the Earth all the way up to the Paleozoic era when you started to think about life on the planet. And so even beyond that, it wasn't until the Ordovician Silurian boundary, which is right about here, you can see we start to see land plants. We start to see trees and reeds. And so before the Ordovician Silurian boundary, which is only in the last 10% of the life of the Earth, there were no plants, and there was no mud either, right? Because you need, as it turns out, you need plants to form muds because plants react with the minerals to form soils. And so since that time, when land plants emerged, we've had an abundance of mud throughout the remaining geologic record all the way up to the presence of time. But it's a relatively recent phenomenon. So how does mud form? Well, this is kind of the general idea. You have to combine rainfall and organic and plants. It starts with mosses and lichens on the surface. Cracks and crevices form, the water percolates down, and the organic material begins to form acids which break down these rocks to form this fine-grained material that we refer to as mud, right? And so over time, you form soils which contain abundant silt and clay and organic matter all mixed together. And so that's basically how we get mud. It's an organic process. So as a geologist, I think about, what happens to the mud when it's formed. And this gets back to one of the, if you've ever had a sort of a basic geology class, they talk about the rock cycle. Well, the mud cycle is part of the rock cycle. So what happens is mountains form, they begin to erode, and the rainfall carries that material downstream, mixes it with soils and organic matter from rivers, and it's deposited along the coastlines, and some of that is buried, and eventually some of that is returned down into the mantle where these tectonic plates, like off California, are subducting that material and dragging the mud back down into the mantle where it heats, it melts, and that molten lava rises to the surface, contributing to the formation of mountains and closes the rock cycle. So it's literally you're recycling Earth's material through over very long geologic time in this way. So I want to focus in a little bit on sort of the organic component of mud, because I think that's something that I've recently become very interested in, and I've included it in some of my work. And so if you, and I want to think about it in terms of the global CO2 cycle or the different carbon reservoirs on the Earth. So this is just a diagram showing the different reservoirs where we find carbon and carbon dioxide. So basically you find it in the atmosphere. And these numbers that I'm showing here are in pentagrams. And everybody knows what a pentagram is, right? Well, it's a 1 followed by 15 0 grams, okay? And I can convert that into tons. It's about 1 billion tons. A billion tons is about the same amount as the Amazon River discharges in sediment every year, and it's about the weight. It's about the weight of the. Oh my gosh, yes, Professor. According to NASA, oh yes, it's about the weight of Mount Everest. Okay, so that's a billion tons. So this in the atmosphere we have about 816 billion tons or pentagrams of carbon. The oceans quite a bit more. The oceans are a big sink for carbon, about 37,000 plants and soils. And so there are transfers, right, between the plants and the atmospheres and the ocean. We have coal and natural gas over here, but look at this number here for sediments and sedimentary rocks. Okay, so if you look at the stocks of carbon on the Earth, the vast majority of it is locked up in sediments and sedimentary rocks. And so if we disturb kind of the cycling of some of this material, as humans tend to do, we have the potential to impact the global carbon budget in ways that I would say right now we don't fully understand. So just a little bit more about, I'm sure you've all read and heard in the news and maybe thought about a bit, is sort of this idea that we're reaching a critical threshold where we worry about Earth's temperature rising, and the idea is if it rises more than about 2 degrees Celsius, that we're in for a bad ride, right? We've already seen weather get a bit rough and unpredictable. I think that's already sort of a reality. But if you look at the carbon budget, this idea that getting up to 2 degrees, it takes about 272 gigatons of carbon. And so we've used up about this yellow line shows about what we've used up already. So we've only got about 990 gigatons left to emit to the atmosphere before we're really in trouble. And so, the exchange of carbon between the land and emissions through fossil fuels, but also capture by trees, by biota, in the oceans and in the sediments it's all part of the carbon cycle. And we've heard in the news so much about fossil fuel burning, but we really haven't heard very much about what are the effects of humans on the surface of the Earth that may perturb this cycle. So I'll come back to that. And so my focus really today is just to kind of give you a glimpse of the potential importance for this kind of work. So this is what I call the land to ocean aquatic continuum. And we can think about the carbon budget for this part of the Earth. So you have CO2 fixed in the terrestrial ecosystem. Some of that is, and this is also in this pentagrams or billion tons per year. So 4.55, this is an annual value. Some of it is exported to this land to ocean system, and that's simply the river systems that are carrying that material across the landscape. Some of it is stored. In this case, we have a river dam, a major dam on the river. And so you have material, mud and organic carbon that's stored behind that dam. Some of that is released downstream and ultimately makes it to the coastal ocean and forms features such as river deltas that I'll get into in a little bit, and these offshore mud deposits. So these arrows and the numbers associated with them are not well known. They're guesses at best. And so I think we need to do a better job at sort of understanding, like, what is the impact of deforestation? What is the impact of constructions of dams in perturbing the global carbon cycle that may come back to bite us down the road? So let's move on. Now we'll take kind of a fun tour down the Yangtze River, and you can kind of think about visually through some how this material moves and some of the areas that it travels through. So the Yangtze River is the longest river in Asia, and it's the longest river in China. Starts out here in the Tibetan Plateau. So this is China, This is the Yangtze River. We'll start about here. This is an area called the first bend of the Yangtze because it's traveling south along with all these other rivers from the Tibetan Plateau. And for some reason, it jogs north and then cuts east across China. We'll stop at the first bend. We'll visit the city of Chongqing, come down to the Poyang Lake here between Wuhan and Nanjing, and then head out to Shanghai. So just a few photos. And this is actually from a 2017 trip that I took with a small group of William and Mary students as a study abroad experience. And it starts here near a town called Lijiang, up in the Jade Snow Dragon Mountains, or sorry, the Jade Dragon Snow Mountains. And so we went up on this long trolley up to the top, and you can see the mountains poking out here. And this is the glacier that's formed, and it's actually the most southerly mountain glacier in the northern hemisphere. So the mountains are so high, it's actually down pretty far south, but there's still glacial ice. And you can see within that ice, it's mixed up with soils, rocks, and sediments. So this is the first part of this journey of mud from the mountains to the ocean, where it's ground down and picked up by these glaciers and moved down slope. And then ultimately, as these glacial materials melt, they'll contribute water along with rainfall into these big streams. And so now we're all the way down. This is an area called the first bend of the Yangtze, and this is our little group. We have joined up with Chinese colleagues from Xiamen University, and we're standing at the first bend. And so this is kind of a typical area where you can see the very rich agricultural regions, which are formed on the banks of these rivers. And you can see the turbidity, or this mud that's flowing downstream. When the river floods, it fertilizes this area with fresh soil. And so it's very productive, great areas for agriculture. And there's a great little story behind this first bend. Remember, I mentioned the other rivers continue south, but according to Chinese legend, these three rivers, or three sisters, were heading south, and they were arguing about which way to go. And one of them said they wanted to find love, and so they decided to head east, and that was the Yangtze River. It's actually a geological uplift event that caused the change in direction. So Tiger Leaping Gorge, a little bit further down from First Bend, I showed another shot of that in my very first photo. It's this tremendous volume of water moving through a very narrow gorge. And I wish I had a video to show you, but just imagine this roaring sound of a tiger as it moves through. And the volume of water and mud moving through this area is about 3 Olympic swimming pools per second. So it's a lot of water moving through there, and carrying this mud downstream. So rivers are great places to build cities. They're convenient for transport, a good water supply. This is sort of in central China, in the city of Chongqing, and you can see here 2 distributaries. This is the Yangtze, and this is the Jilang coming together in Chongqing. And notice, of course, there's a big difference in their turbidity. Like the Yangtze is very muddy, and at this time of the year, the Jiling is not so much. So you can see the contrast in the waters. But this area floods on a regular basis. They've had flooding issues along the Yangtze for as long as people have lived there. It's the biggest megacity in the world, over 30 million permanent inhabitants of this area that have to live on the muddy banks of the Yangtze. And then further downstream, we come to the Three Gorges Dam. And this is very typical of large rivers around the world. Dams have been in place for a variety of reasons, including flood control, but also hydroelectric power generation. So this dam is still the largest in terms of the installed capacity for hydroelectric power. 22,500 megawatts of power is generated from this dam. The dam is regulated to prevent downstream floodings, but sometimes floods happen. You can't predict Mother Nature. And when it rains hard and the water starts to fill in behind the dam, at some point, they've got to release that water before the dam fails. And so this is showing an uncontrolled release of water from an impending flood that's about to break the dam. So we can engineer to a certain extent, but we still have to deal with Mother Nature. And the downstream impacts of that flooding is shown here. This is July 14th in 2020, when you have further downstream in the Yangtze near Nanjing. You have this Poying Lake area, and you can see this whole area is just inundated with muddy water. And this is the end of the road. I've fast forwarded through Shanghai, which Shanghai is actually built on the Yangtze Delta. And we've gone out to the coast, and you can see they're actually trying to do some engineering to reclaim land at the end of the Delta to actually grow land by putting in these rock walls. But this is kind of the end of the road on the land side for this mud transport system. And so what I want to switch to now is to kind of talk about this important depot center, or this important area where mud is dumped from the rivers. And these are river deltas, and they're offshore mud deposits. So river deltas, like rivers in general, are great areas for development. There's something like almost 500 million people living on river deltas around the world. It's equivalent to you have a relatively small area, but a lot of people living there. And it's thought that deltas are really the cradle of human civilization. These are the mud deposits that I like to study. This is where civilization arose. And so this is the Nile Delta. The delta comes from the triangular shape of the Nile Delta, which is the Greek letter delta. Deltas come in many different shapes and sizes, from the lobate Mississippi River to the cuspate Sao Francisco to the estuarine-like Fly River. And all of that is controlled by sort of the coastal energy regime, the size of the rivers versus the intensity of the waves and the intensity of the tides. So these three factors come together to shape the coastal morphology and control, what these deltas look like and how they operate in a physical oceanographic way. So I think it's really interesting to think about deltas, because the formation of deltas really coincides with the emergence of civilization, okay? And so I mentioned these are great places to live. And so if you look back through time, so this is sea level rise. So we know about 20,000 years ago, we had much of the northern hemisphere was covered by a large ice sheet, right? The last glaciation. And during that time, sea level was about 120 meters below where it is at present, okay? And then starting at about 20 to 18,000 years ago, those glaciers began to melt rapidly, and sea level rose all the way up from minus 120 to near the present sea level. And then that rate of sea level rise flattened out. Okay, so that inflection from the very rapid rise to when it flattened out is actually the happy birthday of deltas around the world, all right? Because as soon as the sea level rise rate slowed, that sediment was able to build up this significant deposit, which then people came build their homes and made their livelihoods on. So it's a really I think it's a really fascinating intersection between the geology and the emergence of major civilizations on our planet. So deltas are areas that are at extreme risk. If you look around the world, they've been the preferred habitat for millennia, but they are under threat as a result of sea level rise and as a result of human modifications. These areas are undergoing very rapid erosion. And why is that? Why are deltas at risk? Okay, so now we have to do a little bit of science. And I have to, so this is the math part of the talk, right? Everybody hates to see equations, but I'll try to walk you through it and just kind of say it in a natural and hopefully logical way. So if you look at, here's the delta surface, this line here, right? And what are the different factors that are keeping that surface above sea level, right? Here's sea level, here, this brown line. And so one is the aggradation. And just that, all that means is how much mud are you dumping in there? How much soil are you dumping in there? The faster you dump soil in, the faster that surface is going to rise, right? But that rate of growth of the land and emergence out of the water is in a battle for its life against a couple of things. One is the global increase in water volume in the ocean. We call it eustasy, but it's just the amount of stuff that's melting off glaciers and mountain glaciers and continental glaciers and the expansion of the ocean as a result of steric effects, which causes the volume of the ocean to increase. So you've got land building up, but the ocean is also rising. Deltas have a third problem or a third issue that's very important, and that's sinking. Okay, deltas are literally sinking, and they're sinking because that watery, muddy sediment is compacting, right? It goes from watery clay down to a hard mud, a stiff mud. So that dewatering causes the land to sink. You're also loading it with sediment, so that whole land surface sinks. And so if you do the math, and we don't have to go through it in detail, but if you do the math, you look at the eustatic sea level component and the subsidence component, the relative change is about anywhere from 2 to 9 millimeters per year, which is very, very rapid. So the water volume increase and the expansion of the oceans is about 1.5 to 3, but because deltas are also sinking, that rate is accelerated almost a factor of 5. So these are areas that are sinking very quickly and are under threat. I mentioned human effects on deltas, and so what have humans done? And basically, what they've done is they've whiplashed deltas for 2 reasons. So this graph just shows sort of the sediment load of rivers over the last millennia, okay, when humans have really started to have a big effect on the river loads. And what you see, just focus on this top one. So 1,000 years ago, this was kind of the natural sediment or the natural mud load of the rivers. And then it peaked about a few hundred years ago, and then it dropped off to almost nothing. And that's very typical of a large river. So the 2 causes for that are, first is farming and deforestation, right? Early human agriculture, and then later on, kind of industrial scale agriculture. And then the drop off is mainly because of damming of the rivers. So in one case, we've increased the sediment loads through land use practices, and then we've cut it right off because of dams and other river control structures. So we've really put the kibosh on the rivers. And then the other factor that becomes important, so this is an example from the Chao Phraya Delta in Thailand. And these little contours here show the sinking rate of the land as a result just of water withdrawal. So pumping groundwater out of the earth actually causes the land to subside. And so these areas are just been hit very hard by a number of different human factors. And so if you look at some of these areas around the planet, this is the Mississippi Delta, the Mekong, Euphrates, Ganges, Indus, and so on. The important thing to note from this slide is this pink area, or this pink to reddish color. Those are areas that are below sea level. Okay. Anyone recognize where this particular area is? That is our city of New Orleans, which is actually sits below sea level. You have to pump water out of the city in order to keep it from flooding. So there's a lot of people living in these areas, and they're under extreme risk. Okay, so then I want to talk about, so getting close to wrapping up here, I just want to talk a little bit about these mud depot centers and their role in the carbon cycle. So if you do and I won't belabor it, I'll just make a few bullets here to kind of maybe get you thinking about it. So if you do the budgeting of where carbon is being sequestered at the present time, most of it, the vast majority of it, is in river deltas and their offshore muddy deposits. Okay. And that's before humans started to mess with it. Now, what happens going forward? That's an open question. In some cases, and so when we start to look at some of these areas, in some cases we see that the mud deposits are buried very efficiently. So the terrestrial carbon that's coming out is buried and it's removed from exchange with the atmosphere. In other cases, the carbon is actually burned in these coastal areas, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And that CO2 goes right back up into the atmosphere. And really, the sort of, if I don't get to the end of my talk or all my slides, what I wanted to leave you with is that human activity is changing these balances, and so we need to do a better job of understanding what our influence is on the surface of the planet in terms of the global CO2. So here's another area. Actually, this is where I started working in my academic career, the Amazon Delta and the Amazon Mud Belt. So this is an image from space. You can see the curvature of the Earth. It gives you a sense of how large this system is. It actually extends from the equator up to the Orinoco Delta, which is about 1,600 kilometers along the coast. And you can see this very muddy, turbid water, which goes all the way up along the coastline. And I'll make one quick point, which is that if you look at this area, and this is just a simple map showing the same area, you see this muddy coastline and these mud banks, which move from the mouth of the Amazon here all the way up to the Orinoco River. And as they do so, they turn over and they come into contact with oxygen from the atmosphere, which causes that which causes the organic carbon to break down and emit CO2. And so we've actually looked at this, and I won't go into the science too much, but this is the trend as we go from the mouth of the Amazon all the way up to the Guianas and Orinoco. And this is the amount of organic carbon. It goes from about 0.7 to 0.1. So about a factor of 5 decrease, so this is a carbon incinerator. It's not a sink in this particular example. And it's an important example because it's the biggest river in the world. Second biggest river in the world, another place that I've had the opportunity to study, the Ganges Brahmaputra, completely different story. So this is just a simple map showing, this is the Tibetan Plateau again. We visited that earlier with the Yangtze. This is the Ganges Delta. But notice here, you've got a major submarine canyon, which comes in and cuts into the shoreline. And this feature here is the Bengal fan. And so about a third of the river sediment coming out today goes right down into the deep ocean. and is actually actively building this fan. And this is a huge feature. It's about 3,000 kilometers long and about 16 kilometers thick. Okay, and so in this particular case, any terrestrial carbon coming down from the river and getting into the fan system is buried, and it's removed from the atmosphere forever. So in this case, it's an area of highly efficient carbon burial. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I just want to give you a little bit of a sort of primer into an area that I've been working in most recently, and this is the Irrawaddy Delta in the northern Andaman Sea. This is an incredible area. So again, here just to give you scale, this is from the International Space Station. These are the tributaries to the Irrawaddy, and they empty into this giant bay. Look at the mud. Okay, you've got an area of 45,000 square kilometers. This is about 250 kilometers across here of just muddy water. So just to kind of give you perspective, this is the Irrawaddy here, and these black numbers are the sediment loads, and these are the current sediment loads. And you can see for the other major Asian rivers, we've looked at the Yangtze. I've got both red numbers and black numbers. Well, the red numbers are kind of pre-human numbers or historical numbers for sediment load, and the black numbers are the current ones. What's the difference? Well, in a word, dams. Okay, a lot of these rivers have major dams in place, and so their historical loads are much greater than the current day loads. The exception is the Irrawaddy. It's a relatively natural system, although there are plans to dam the main stem. It hasn't happened yet. It will soon. So this is a great opportunity to study this sensitive delta area in its natural state. Again, this area is even in the natural state, it's still subject to flooding. This is sort of the track of a cyclone that came across, Cyclone Nargis, which was really devastating. You can see kind of the before and the afterwards flooding here. Many thousands of people lost their lives in this particular one. So we were lucky to get in to work with colleagues in Myanmar in between the previous previous military dictatorship and the present one. So after the British left and before the recent takeover. So back in 2017, we took a research cruise. We took sediment cores, made many different kinds of measurements, geophysical measurements, oceanographic measurements. And I won't spend a lot of time dragging you through it, but we also had a modeling component. And so I just want to show you what we found. So this is an image from a acoustic profiler. It's like a fish finder on steroids, right? It's got a little bit higher power. So it penetrates into the sub-bottom, and you can map the seafloor and the sub-bottom. So this is the surface. So these are the mouths of the river here. And so if you go out onto the shelf, this is the transect 27, and you can see these nicely layered deposits here, very thick. This is about a 50-meter thick deposit. And I can tell you from coring it and also from its acoustic signature that it's all mud. So this is the offshore mud deposit that I was referring to earlier. And this is likely a sink for organic carbon coming down these rivers. This is the outer part of the shelf, which is rough and rugged. It reflects the last glacial period. And so it's not really active today, but here we have this large mud deposit growing out into the northern Andaman Sea. This is a core sample that we recovered, and you can kind of just see from the picture how muddy it is. And so what we've done is we've kind of developed a conceptual model for this area. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it turns out that this brown area, which is the really muddy area on the seafloor, really extends out from that highly turbid Gulf and into this depression on the shelf. And this is an area of extreme high tides. I mean, we're talking 7-meter way high tides. And those tidal currents are energetic enough to continuously stir the bottom, which creates that zone of high perennial turbidity that I showed in the photo from the space station. And so in this area of the Gulf, we have it's like a reactor. The bottom is constantly being stirred. It's being reoxygenated, and that carbon may be burned off. Eventually, it moves offshore into this big mud wedge into the depression, and that's probably an area of carbon burial. How much carbon is actually oxidized and incinerated versus what's buried is unknown. That's a subject for hopefully for our future work. So I'll just leave you with a few bullets. I think we started off looking at the many uses, both fun and not so fun uses of mud. Mud is a recent geological phenomenon. It's only been around for about 10% of the life of the planet, and it's got to do with the evolution of land plants. Big take home is mud is the biggest reservoir of carbon on the planet, and humans are actively disturbing where mud is being oxidized, where it's buried, where it's transported, and very likely affecting the exchange between this major carbon reservoir and the atmosphere. Deltas, we talked about deltas and their offshore mud deposits as being hotspots. And so these are areas we'd like to focus on in the future in order to understand this issue of carbon storage. So it's back to humans. You know, we're making changes to the planet, and it's our job as scientists to figure out what the downstream ramifications of that are. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you learned something about mud tonight.
All right. If you have any questions in the audience, please raise your hand and we will bring you a microphone. And
yeah, I have a question. How does dredging affect, dredging for ports and shipping and stuff affect the CO2 and that kind of stuff?
Sure, that's a major human activity. Dredging is a big one. Also, trawling, like offshore trawling, is another big one. A lot of the increase in infilling of navigable channels is a result of kind of increased sediment loads from land use practices. And so that stuff ends up in the water and ends up in filling up the channels that we're trying to keep open. So I would say as a general theme that, whenever you kind of dig that stuff up and cast it off to the side or you're exposing it to oxygen. And so that's another opportunity for the breakdown of organic matter and the release of CO2 into the atmosphere.
What does mud turn into clay or?
Okay, so yeah. Again, this is the science definition for me. So clay is a size difference. So mud contains both silt and clay. All right, and the boundary in the size and the diameter is 2 microns. So anything between 2 microns and 63 microns is silt. Anything less than 2 microns is clay. Usually they're found together, and so we just call it mud. But I think maybe what you're asking is how do you remove the silt and end up with the fine clay? A lot of that has to do with hydraulic sorting. So I showed you that example of the Amazon River where you had that very long, that 1,600 kilometer coastal mud belt. Well, it starts out fairly silty, and by the end of it, it's mostly clay because the coarser particles kind of drop out first along that transport pathway. So that's one way to sort out the silt from the clay. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I know that mudflats are like a important habitat for certain marine creatures and stuff.
Yep.
As far as whether they take the carbon out or put carbon back into the atmosphere, is it more of a carbon sink or a carbon burner thing with a mudflat?
Oh, in mudflats.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question. I haven't really thought much about mudflats, but these are typically in areas of high tidal ranges, like around Korea. I mean, that's why they have the mud festival there. They have extensive mudflats there. Yeah, I don't know. It's got to do with how rapidly that stuff is buried and removed from contact with the atmosphere. So my best guess, it would depend on how fast those mudflats are accreting versus eroding. And I don't know if I can give you a general answer to that question.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question, though.
Hi, Steve. We have a couple questions on Zoom,
Okay.
if you don't mind. The first is the average depth of the Chesapeake Bay water decreasing due to mud deposits?
Is the average depth decreasing? That's a fair question. I don't know. I don't know what's happening in terms of I would imagine you do have some filling in for sure in the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay. The major input is the Susquehanna River, and you saw that turbidity zone that I showed in the satellite photo. So I would imagine the answer is yes, it's filling in, and that's true for most estuaries around the world. I'd say that's a generality I'm fairly comfortable making, because over time, what's the difference between an estuary and a delta, right? The difference is the delta has had enough sediment supply such that the estuary has filled in and now it's growing seaward. And so we haven't had quite enough time, in part because the Chesapeake Bay is pretty large and the rivers that come into it are pretty puny.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take another from Zoom before asking the in-person audience. The next one is, what effect does all the sediment and mud have on sea level rise as a whole?
That's an interesting question. So I guess from a physics perspective, if you're dumping more mud into the ocean, then you're going to reduce the size of the bowl, and so sea level will rise. The question is really, to me, when I think about that, is what's the balance? And there's been actually a lot of work recently that talks about, well, you have major rivers which are being dammed and the sediments are being trapped upstream, but there are other smaller river areas that because of land use changes actually supply more sediment. And so whether there's more or less sediment getting to the ocean, I think, is actually an open question. Yeah. All these things we don't know.
Maybe we'll ask one more before finishing out for the night. And do you want to do the in-person? Okay.
Are the Chinese more interested in studying mud than we are?
Well, I would say that the Chinese they've done a lot of work on some of these muddy offshore deposits. In fact, if you search the literature for work on the Yangtze, on the underwater part of the Yangtze Delta, I would say there are probably 10 times more publications than there are off the Mississippi River. So they're quite interested. They have a very active marine science community, and although they have a major impact and a major footprint on the planet, they're also aware of that and trying to mitigate where possible. Yeah. Good question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kuehl, and thank you to everyone who joined us in person and online today. Our next after hours will be in August, so hopefully we will see you all June 10th on Marine Science Day. If you have any questions that we were not able to ask the presenter, please send them to programs@bims.edu and we'll send them over to Dr. Kuehl. And once again, thank you, Dr. Kuehl.
Welcome.